Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is the 100 days. The year is 1933. It's March the 4th. It's Inauguration Day. After a very difficult interregnum, Franklin Roosevelt is ready to take his oath of office and become the 32nd President of the United States. The United States is in crisis, a banking crisis very much underway as the Great Depression continues to go on full bore. What is Franklin Roosevelt going to say about it? Well, he spoke directly to the American people. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive, and will prosper. And then the line that eventually changed the tone in the entire country. Franklin Roosevelt said, "So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." This was the kind of change in tone that the American people were looking for. And this is what they got from Franklin Roosevelt. And it had an impact across the country immediately. And it also had, with his words in this speech, an impact in Congress, because he had a word for them as well. According to Roosevelt, in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses that he talked about in the speech, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we're in fact invaded by a foreign foe. Again, changing the tone in the country. Someone's in charge. Someone is out there to fight for the American people. This is what they wanted, the reassurance. He was off to a good start. The next day, he got his cabinet together and he tried to figure out what to do about this banking crisis. The banks had already been shut down by the states voluntarily. He wanted to know from his attorney general, was the Trading with the Enemies Act from World War I left over still operative? And the attorney general said yes. So Roosevelt used that to declare a national bank holiday. All the banks would be shut until the federal government said it was okay to open them. How much time was he going to give his team to figure that out? 4 days. Come up with legislation, because I'm calling Congress into a special session on March the 9th. Well, the Roosevelt team, economic team, started meeting with the Hoover team, the leftovers. They basically went to the Treasury Department and changed seats because they had already been working together prior to the inauguration. The same people kept working, and in 4 days, working day and night, they finally came up with a plan to gradually reopen the banks based on certain conditions that would be overseen by the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. They also agreed on a method to add liquidity into the system by printing new money that was specifically backed by assets that were in the Federal Reserve system. Well, they came up with this legislation that was actually still being printed when the House was gavelled to order on that March the 9th date. House didn't bother with anything. It's a Democratic Congress at this point. They were ready to support the president. Most of them voted in favor of the banking bill without ever having read it. The Senate actually took a little bit of time to debate, but that same day they voted 73-7 to approve the Banking Act. And Roosevelt had his law, but he wasn't going to just sit on the legislation. He realized he had a role to play, and he was not only going to be their commander-in-chief, he was going to be the American people's communicator-in-chief. A technique that he had used so effectively when he was the governor of New York, the power of the new medium of radio that he was so good at, to take the complex and make it simple and create almost a personal relationship with his constituents. So on Sunday night, March the 12th, 60 million people tuned in to hear their president say that I want to talk to you for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. I want to tell you what's been done in the past few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system. It's up to you to support and make it work. It's your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail. Well, the success of all of this, the next morning, people lining up at their banks to return money. Now, they had all been taking money out because they were afraid the banks were going to fail and they were going to lose all of their cash. Now they are almost immediately thousands of people lining up to return money into the banks. The confidence had been restored. Roosevelt's optimism was infectious. As Ray Moley said, capitalism was saved in 8 days. Roosevelt wasn't going to stop there. He was ready for an aggressive legislative blitz, so he kept Congress in special session. This was something like the country had never seen from a legislative standpoint at the beginning of a presidency. It was all about the New Deal. Well, what was that? Ray Moley talked about it. He was one of the architects, and he later wrote the New Deal was a policy of cooperative business government planning to combat the instability of economic operations and the insecurity of livelihood. That the problem of government was to enable the whole people to enjoy the benefits of mass production and distribution, economy, and security, and it was the duty of government to devise with business the means of social and individual adjustment to the facts of the industrial age. These were the heart and soul of the New Deal, according to Ray Moley. So, time to get to action. And one of the things that Roosevelt had talked a lot in the campaign about, he wanted a balanced budget. He wanted to cut federal spending. He put over a recommendation for a bill to take $500 million out of the current year budget. A lot of it came from veterans' benefits. Roosevelt would fight throughout his presidency to try to get to balanced budgets. He only got there once. Most of the time, he was actually spending far more than any president in American history, with large deficits and large debt, but at least out the door, trying to make good on his campaign pledge. Now we're at March the 13th. The banks are starting to reopen. That goes well almost immediately. And then Roosevelt came out with another campaign pledge to opt for prohibition repeal. And he had talked about this a lot in the campaign. Congress, before he became president, actually had recently passed the authorizing legislation for a new amendment to the Constitution to repeal prohibition. Roosevelt on this day was advocating the states. Let's ratify this thing. Let's get it done. By December, that was a thing of the past as well. Agriculture Adjustment Act. This was one of the first major pieces of New Deal legislation, the AAA. This was probably the most intrusive step the federal government had ever played in the American economy, because the American federal government was going to pay farmers not to plant, or to plant less. The idea was decreased supply would help increase prices and therefore increase profits, help farmers get out of debt, and help, again, try to end these elements of the Depression. Well, this again was a controversial move. This one was not passed quite so quickly. It took a couple of months. It was May by the time that Roosevelt got the AAA passed, and that timing mattered because by then the spring crops had already been planted. So now the federal government was actually going to pay subsidies to farmers to dig up new crops. Now, this was anathema to a lot of farmers, but again, they had to look at the big picture about supply and demand, and of course, if they wanted the subsidy, that's what they did. They dug up their crops. They slaughtered 6 million baby piglets, not for food, but to actually take them out of the supply to once again try to rebalance supply and demand and get prices up. The AAA was very controversial. Conservatives from both parties, again, thought this was un-American, including former President Herbert Hoover, who put it this way when Hoover said that fascism came to agriculture by the way of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This act and supplemental acts and their consequences of products and markets set up an uncanny Americanized parallel of control with the agricultural regime of Mussolini and Hitler. Conservatives aghast, the American people were fine. In fact, they were embracing this experimentation from their new president. Next up, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. Here, the idea was to put unemployed young American males to work, about 250,000 of them initially. What were they going to do? Plant trees. They were going to dig fire breaks, build bridges, dig ditches, the kinds of things that could provide real benefits from a conservation standpoint, and also give the pride of work and compensation from work to these young male Americans. They'd get paid a decent wage, $30 a month. They were required, though, to send $25 a month back home to their families to try to get the trickle-down effect of this influx of cash. Roosevelt put Harry Hopkins in charge of this. Very aggressive New Dealer, one of the most aggressive in getting stuff done. He had worked with Roosevelt in New York. Now he's in charge of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Next up, the Farm Credit Association. This took a bunch of disparate agencies and consolidated them into a single view under Henry Morgenthau, who would administer that program. Next was the Truth in Securities Act. This was to provide greater transparency to investors, which really didn't exist so far in the markets in the past. And also, again, the first time the federal government had ever gotten into the mix of regulating securities, Truth in Securities Act passed next. The federal government next passed the Homeowners Loan Association, or Corporation. What was this doing? To help people stay in their homes by refinancing distressed mortgages and also providing new and longer repayment schedules, again, to try to keep people from getting kicked out and foreclosed upon. Rural electrification had been a pet project and an idea for Roosevelt. Certainly he had pursued it in New York. It was a big deal in Georgia at Warm Springs, where most of the farmers around there had no source of electricity. He got in partnership with a senator from the South, George Norris, who decided to put the power of the Tennessee River to work. They called it the Tennessee Valley Authority. They were going to build dams, generate hydroelectric power, and the government would fund distribution of that power into the most rural areas because the private sector simply found that to be uneconomic. Again, the conservatives cried foul. They said that is not the role of the federal government in the United States. In our system, that belongs to the private sector, the distribution of power. Roosevelt said, well, but they're not doing it. And these people need electricity too, so the government is going to step in. Most of the people in the country were in favor of it. Mid-April, Roosevelt took the step to take the United States off the gold standard. Now, most of the countries around the world had already done this during the Depression. Really, only the United States and France were left on the gold standard, and that actually was putting the United States at a disadvantage. And Roosevelt said no more. He was going to slowly raise the price of gold. That would help cheapen the dollar, better for debtors, including farmers. He also thought this would help raise prices. Did not bode well for that World Economic Conference we talked about in the previous episode that was coming up in London, because the purpose of that was to get people back on the gold standard. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The National Industrial Recovery Act was next, created the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. This was among the most controversial of the New Deal legislations from the very beginning. The idea was to take the same concepts of the Agricultural Act and apply it to industry. Groups would be created that would create codes that would prescribe standards for those industries, including minimum and maximum prices, product quantities. This was a problem for small businesses. They were kind of left out of this because the large businesses really dictated what those policies were going to be. Antitrust concerns were waived as part of the NRA legislation. Also, labor was felt they were sort of left out of this, but the codes technically were going to be voluntary, but really seemed a lot of pressure for people to comply. In fact, they created this symbol, the blue eagle, that would go in the window of shops that were actually embracing the codes from the NRA. Roosevelt put it this way, that those who cooperate in this program must know each other at a glance. That's why we've provided a badge of honor for this purpose. Hugh Johnson, the former military officer who was put in charge of the NRA, a very bombastic and hard-charging kind of guy, he put it this way: "May God have mercy on the man or group of men who attempt to trifle with this bird." Voluntary codes? Not really. Again, the opposition pounced on this, and it wasn't only the Republicans, but conservative Democrats like Al Smith, who at one point had been a mentor to Roosevelt, now completely estranged. Al Smith put it this way: a vast octopus set up by government that wound its arms around all the business of the country, paralyzed big business, and choked little business to death. The NRA, controversial. Most of the Americans, again, embracing because they wanted the experimentation, but this one was a little more difficult, especially for those small businessmen. Roosevelt, this isn't un-American. This is necessary in the current crisis. This was an inflection point in American history. These pieces of legislation, the more intrusive element of the United States in solving the people's problems, particularly in the economy, that had not been the American way in the past. It would be the American way under Franklin Roosevelt, and in very many ways for times to come. The NRA legislation also has spawned the Public Works Administration, the PWA, which authorized $3.3 billion in large-scale public works. The Interior Secretary Ickes was put in charge of this, which actually didn't work out very well because the idea was to spend that money quickly. He was pretty cautious and kind of slow in action, but that would also play out over time. Finally, in the 100 days for legislation, the Glass-Steagal Banking Reform Act. Now, this was less about short-term recovery, more about long-term reform to separate the investment banks from the regular banking institutions, to kind of de-risk that because of the separation. It was also the first measure that would guarantee individual banking deposits. In this case, up to $2,500, which covered about 95% of the individual accounts in banks. A new organization, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, was created to oversee this, which was based on funding that was provided by Federal Reserve banks that would create this insurance pool. Again, talk about a way to stabilize the banking industry, give people confidence. Guaranteeing their deposits up to $2,500 was a big way of doing that. A 100-day blitz of legislation for the New Deal, 15 pieces of landmark legislation, they all passed, all had a dramatic impact on the country of that moment, but also setting the stage really for the country going forward on the role of the federal government. One other thing, though, in the 100 days was that World Economic Conference that was starting at the end of the 100-day period in June of 1933 in London, where again the idea was to bring people from across the globe, almost all of whom had gone off the gold standard, to try to figure out a way to create international economic stabilization, perhaps finding paths back to the gold standard. Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of Britain, was the host of this event. It was his idea. He had come over to the United States before the start of the conference, meet personally with Roosevelt, and he said that Roosevelt told him that the goal to get the world as a whole back on some form of gold standard was something that he would support. Well, Secretary of State Cordell Hull would lead the American delegation, again, trying to stabilize the currency, look at the gold standard, maybe reduce tariffs. That was kind of a pet project for Hull, but there was kind of infighting in the American delegation, and part of this was Roosevelt's fault because it wasn't really all that clear in the specific instructions that he was given. So after a couple of weeks, when this wasn't going all that well, he decided to send Ray Moley over to kind of get in the mix and really make sure he is pursuing what the president wanted. Now, this was going to be a problem because Moley was an assistant secretary of state, technically. That meant he worked for Secretary Hull. But Roosevelt's model was that Moley would basically go and work directly for him, and in the capacity going over to the conference, he was really Roosevelt's representative, even though he was subordinate to Hull. This was a messy situation, but the public, or the delegations basically look now as Moley is the guy in charge. Premier MacDonald actually started meeting with Moley one-on-one. They came up with a relatively innocuous statement about countries being willing and interested in returning to the gold standard, with a very clear caveat that each nation would decide for themselves the timing of that move. This was something that, again, Moley thought was relatively innocuous and a kind of a good faith measure on behalf of the countries at this conference. So he sent it off to the president, who took a couple of days to think about it. And after he thought about it, he didn't like it. And he said so in a telegram back to the delegations called the bombshell message, because it basically blew up the entire conference. Roosevelt wrote that the world will not long be lulled by the specious fallacy of achieving a temporary and probably an artificial stability in foreign exchange on the part of a few large countries only. The sound internal economic system of a nation is a greater factor in its well-being than the price of its currency in changing terms of the currencies of other nations. This was economic nationalism. He's focusing on the United States problem, but this basically, again, blew up this international conference. Prime Minister MacDonald was beside himself. He told Moley in a private one-on-one conference, "This doesn't sound like the man I spent so many hours with in Washington. This sounds like a different man. I don't understand. Roosevelt cannot imagine what he has done to me, to that conference, and to others," because a lot of people, including the press, saw this as a very public rebuke of Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Ray Moley, the guy who had just been sent over. Moley and the president were not quite as much on the same page here in the early days of the administration as they had been during the campaign. They were already moving a little bit separate in their ideas around the New Deal. This one kind of put him over the edge. Within a month, Ray Moley resigned from the federal government. Now, he would stick around for most of the first term of Franklin Roosevelt, helping him behind the scenes, working on speeches and policy initiatives and things like that. But increasingly, Moley would become very much a thorn in the side of Roosevelt, an antagonist, both the way he was implementing the New Deal and other things. One of his harshest critics over time would be the end story for Ray Moley. Plenty of criticism about all of these things coming from the conservative side of the House, but Roosevelt didn't pay much attention to that because the people were mostly praising him. They liked his aggressive nature. They liked his experimentation. He was working for them on their behalf to try to fix this economy, and they loved a lot of the things that he was doing, and they liked this legislative blitz unlike the country had ever seen before. That's Franklin Roosevelt and the 100 Days from the Life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.